A fault system that has produced two of the largest earthquakes ever recorded on Earth just fired again. Today, a magnitude 5. 0 struck the Andreanoff Islands. In March, a 6-tone. 4 hit near Boulder Island. Neither made the news. Both sit on the same 3,000-kilometer arc that produced a 9. 2 in 1964. Still the second largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded on the planet. Scientists don't watch this chain because it might break. They watch it because parts of it haven't broken in 80 years. And that silence is the part that worries them. Start with the shape of the thing, because almost nobody outside of Alaska has a mental picture of it. The Aleutian Arc stretches nearly 3,000 kilometers, curving out from the Gulf of Alaska, past Kodiak, past the Alaska Peninsula, out through a chain of volcanic islands most people could not find on a map, all the way to the Kamchatka Peninsula on the Russian side of the Pacific. Underneath that curve, the Pacific Plate is diving beneath the North American Plate at a rate of roughly 6 to 7 centimeters a year. That sounds small. It is not small. Over a human lifetime, that is several meters of accumulated motion, all of it trying to happen at once, all of it locked in place by friction until the rock finally gives. That give is what you're looking at whenever an Aleutian earthquake appears on your screen. And this particular stretch of ocean floor has given catastrophically before. On March 27, 1964, the ground beneath Prince William Sound ruptured for nearly 5 minutes. The shaking alone was almost unsurvivable that close to the source. The magnitude came in at 9.2, a number so large it is difficult to translate into anything meaningful except comparison. It remains the second largest earthquake ever measured with modern instruments anywhere on the planet, behind only the 1960 earthquake in Chile. It killed well over 100 people, most of them not from the shaking itself, but from the tsunami that followed, waves that reached the coast of California and left casualties as far away as Oregon. Entire sections of Alaskan coastline dropped or rose by meters in a matter of minutes. Anchorage, hundreds of kilometers from the epicenter, suffered landslides that swallowed neighborhoods whole. That is the ceiling this fault system has already reached once. It is not a hypothetical model output. It happened, it was measured, and the scars are still visible in the geology today. And 1964 was not an isolated event on an otherwise quiet fault. 7 years earlier, in 1957, the Andreanoff Islands, the same stretch of the chain that just produced today's magnitude 5. 0 ruptured at magnitude 8. 6, a slip so long that it broke roughly 1/200 kilometers of the plate boundary in one event, the longest rupture length of any earthquake in the historic Aleutian record. 8 years after that, in 1965, the Rat Islands, further west, let go at magnitude 8. 7. Then, in 1986, and again in 1996, the Andreanoff Islands broke a second and third time, both above magnitude 7. 9. In 2003, the Rat Islands ruptured again at 7. 8. And as recently as 2014, an earthquake near Little Sitkin Island in the western Aleutians hit magnitude 7. 9. At an unusual intermediate depth deep inside the subducting slab itself, rather than on the shallow plate interface. Lay those events out side by side, and a pattern becomes obvious immediately. One that has nothing to do with speculation, and everything to do with 120 years of instrumental record. Since 1900, this single arc has produced 6 earthquakes above magnitude 8. 3. Strung together, those 6 ruptures have broken almost the entire length of the shallow megathrust boundary along the Aleutian chain. Not most of it, nearly all of it. This is not a fault that occasionally produces a large earthquake, the way, say, most of the continental United States does. This is a fault that has systematically worked its way down its own length, segment by segment, releasing energy roughly the way a zipper releases tension tooth by tooth. Except each tooth on this zipper is capable of producing a tsunami that reaches Hawaii, Japan, and the coast of California. So when I tell you that this chain logged a magnitude 5, 0 today, and a 6, 4 in March, I need to be honest about scale immediately, because this is exactly where sensational coverage usually goes wrong. A magnitude 6, 4 is not a magnitude 8. 6, the energy difference between those two numbers on a logarithmic scale, where each whole step represents roughly 32 times more energy released, is enormous. A 6, 4 releases a tiny fraction of what an 8, 6 releases. If I told you these recent earthquakes were themselves the disaster, I would be lying to you, and everything that follows in this video would collapse the moment you fact-checked it. That is not the claim. The claim is about background rate and pattern, and this is the part worth sitting with. The Alaska Earthquake Center's own long-term statistics put this region at roughly 40,000 recorded earthquakes a year across Alaska, and the Aleutians combined. Earthquakes above magnitude 5 happen here around 40 times annually. Above magnitude 6, roughly 6 or 7 times a year. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most seismically active regions on the surface of the Earth. A magnitude 5. 0 striking the Andreanoff Islands on an ordinary Sunday is, by itself, close to background noise. It would not normally be worth a script, What makes it worth talking about is where it sits inside a longer pattern that has been building since at least the end of last year. In December 2024, the Alaska Earthquake Center documented a swarm near Adak in the same Andreanof Islands region, 3 separate earthquakes above magnitude 6 within a short window, along with their attendant aftershocks. 3 months later, in March 2025, the same general area produced a second swarm, 8 separate earthquakes above magnitude 5 within roughly 2 days. The Earthquake Center's own bulletin on that swarm made a specific and important observation. There was no single, clear main shock. The energy did not concentrate into one large rupture followed by a tail of smaller aftershocks decaying in the normal pattern. It came out distributed, spread across a cluster of similarly sized events with no obvious leader. That distinction matters more than most people realize, and it is worth explaining properly because it is the actual mechanism behind everything in this story. When a single locked patch on a fault fails, you get a classic main shock aftershock sequence. One large event releases the stored strain in that patch, and then a series of progressively smaller aftershocks follow as the surrounding rock adjusts to the new stress state, decaying in frequency over days and weeks the way any statistical process settles down. That is a fault healing itself, in a sense, after a single localized failure. A swarm is a different animal entirely. When you see a cluster of similarly sized earthquakes with no dominant main shock, it tells seismologists that stress is being redistributed across a broader volume of crust rather than being concentrated in and released by one specific patch. It suggests the rock in that region is sitting closer to a general failure threshold across a wider area, not that one weak point finally snapped. Individually, that is not alarming. Swarms happen constantly along active plate boundaries, and the overwhelming majority of them simply fade out on their own, releasing accumulated strain in small increments rather than one large event. But repeated swarms in the same general stretch of an already historically productive fault system are exactly the kind of pattern that earns sustained attention from the people whose entire job is reading these signals, because it raises the open question of whether that stress redistribution is quietly loading an adjacent, larger patch that has not yet given way. Which brings us to the concept that sits underneath almost everything seismologists say publicly about this region, and it is a concept most people have never heard of outside of a geology classroom. It is called a seismic gap. A seismic gap is a stretch of an active fault that has not produced a large earthquake in a long time, even though the sections on either side of it have ruptured repeatedly and the underlying plate motion driving the whole system has never paused. The logic behind why this matters is simple, and it is not speculative. The Pacific Plate does not slow down or wait politely for a quiet segment to catch up. It keeps converging with North America at the same 6 to 7 centimeters a year everywhere along the arc, gap or no gap. If a segment is not releasing that accumulated motion through earthquakes, the strain is not disappearing. It is building silently in the rock. The way tension builds in a wire you keep winding tighter without ever letting it spin free. Alaska's Geophysical Institute has identified 3 specific stretches of this boundary that fit that description. Regions that have not produced a major earthquake in 80 years or more. One sits near Yakataga, along the eastern portion of the arc, closer to the Gulf of Alaska. A second sits near the Shumagin Islands, roughly in the middle of the chain. A third sits far to the west, near the Commander Islands, close to where the arc approaches Kamchatka on the Russian side. These are not vague regions on a hand-drawn map. They are specific, named, monitored sections of plate boundary, flanked on both sides by segments that have already ruptured in the historic record, sitting quietly in between while the plates beneath them continue to converge at full speed, uninterrupted, every single year. The Shumagin Gap in particular carries a documented history that goes well beyond the roughly 120 years of modern seismic instrumentation. Researchers from the United States Geological Survey, working alongside the University of Hawaii and the University of California, Santa Cruz, reconstructed a 700-year sequence of earthquakes along the eastern Aleutians, using an entirely different kind of evidence: tsunami deposits. When a large enough earthquake ruptures the seafloor and generates a tsunami, the incoming waves carry sand, shell fragments, and marine debris inland, and under the right coastal conditions, those deposits get buried and preserved in layers, like sedimentary tree rings. By excavating and dating those layers along the coastline, researchers were able to identify a repeating sequence of great earthquakes, stretching back roughly 7 centuries, evidence of tsunamis large enough to carry material more than a kilometer inland from the shoreline. That record runs 6 centuries deeper than anything captured in the instrumental catalog most of us are used to seeing quoted in news coverage, and it says something the shorter modern record cannot say on its own. This arc has done this before, more than once, on a rhythm scientists are still working to fully understand. I want to be precise about what that paleoseismic record does and does not tell us, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets stretched into something it isn't. It does not give us a date. It does not give us a specific magnitude for the next event. What it gives us is confirmation that the modern instrumental catalog, the one that starts around 1900 and contains those 6 great earthquakes above magnitude 8. 3 is not the full story of what this fault system is capable of over a longer timescale. 125 years of measurements is a narrow window to judge a fault that operates on a rhythm measured in centuries. The tsunami deposits extend that window backward by 600 years, and what they show is consistency, not a one-off cluster of unusually large historic events. Now, here's where I need to address the objection that anyone paying close attention should already be forming, because ignoring it would make this entire video dishonest. None of what I have described so far, not today's magnitude 5. 0, not March's 6. 4 near Boulder, not the swarms recorded near Adak in December 2284 and March 2025, comes anywhere close to megathrust scale. None of these events, individually or combined, are the earthquake this story is actually about. Comparing a magnitude 5. 0 directly to the 1964 magnitude, 9. 2 would be scientifically indefensible, and if any coverage tells you these small events are themselves the disaster, that coverage is misrepresenting the science to get your attention. I'm not going to do that here. What I am describing is a background condition, not a countdown clock. Seismologists cannot tell you when a seismic gap will rupture. They cannot tell you which gap will go first, or whether the next great Aleutian earthquake will strike Yakataga, the Shumagins, the Commander Islands, or somewhere else along the arc entirely that has not been specifically flagged. What they can tell you, with confidence grounded in more than a century of instrumental data and 700 years of paleoseismic evidence, is that this fault system has a demonstrated habit of releasing its accumulated strain in earthquakes large enough to be catastrophic, that it has done so repeatedly across nearly its entire length, and that specific segments of it have gone unusually long without doing so, while the underlying plate motion never stopped. There's also a geographic reality about this fault system that deserves its own explanation, because it is the reason an earthquake out near the Aleutian Islands, thousands of kilometers from any major population center, is not simply a remote curiosity. This is a subduction zone, meaning the fault plane is not vertical like a strike-slip fault. It is a shallow, gently dipping interface where one plate is sliding underneath another. When that kind of fault ruptures across a large enough area, it does not just shake the ground. It can displace the seafloor itself, vertically, sometimes by meters, and that vertical displacement of a massive volume of ocean water is what generates a tsunami. The 1964 earthquake proved this in the worst possible way, sending destructive waves down the entire west coast of North America. Earlier events in the same arc, in 1946 and 1957, generated tsunamis that crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and caused damage and casualties as far away as Hawaii. A rupture on the Aleutian megathrust does not stay a local Alaskan story. The ocean carries the consequences to coastlines that have never felt the shaking at all. This is precisely why the tsunami warning infrastructure covering the Pacific exists in the form it does today, largely built and refined in direct response to what this exact fault system has already done. The National Tsunami Warning Center maintains pre-calculated rupture scenarios for fault segments across the Pacific Basin, specifically so that when an earthquake occurs, an advisory or warning can be issued within minutes rather than requiring a forecast to be built from scratch under time pressure. That system exists because the Aleutian Arc taught coastal communities, at significant human cost, exactly how fast a distant earthquake can turn into a local emergency. I also want to spend a moment on what this story is not, because misinformation tends to fill in the gaps left by an honest, cautious explanation, and it is filling in fast around any earthquake story right now. This activity in the Aleutian Islands is not connected to unrelated seismic activity elsewhere on the globe. Earthquake triggering across genuinely large distances is a real documented phenomenon in seismology, but it operates through the passing seismic waves themselves, shows a consistent signature concentrated in geothermal and volcanic areas with pressurized fluid systems, and appears during or within hours of the waves passing through, not weeks apart, on unrelated fault systems separated by thousands of kilometers. A magnitude 5. 0 in the Aleutian Islands today has no demonstrated mechanism linking it to whatever else is moving elsewhere on the planet this week. It is a local reading of a local fault, driven by the same plate convergence that has been driving the system for millions of years, not a sign of some coordinated global unrest. It is also not evidence that a magnitude 9 earthquake is imminent, and no legitimate seismologist would frame it that way. Earthquake prediction, in the sense of naming a specific date, location, and magnitude in advance, remains beyond the capability of current science, and that is not a gap anyone expects to close soon. What exists instead, and what this entire story has actually been built around, is probabilistic hazard assessment, an understanding grounded in a century of instrumental data and 7 centuries of geological evidence, of which segments of a known active fault system carry the highest accumulated strain relative to how long they have gone without rupturing. That is a fundamentally different and much more honest kind of statement than a prediction. It tells you where the risk is concentrated. It does not tell you when that risk will convert into an event. So if none of this is a countdown, why does it matter that today's earthquake happened at all? Because the value of watching a system like this is not found in any single earthquake. It is found in the pattern those earthquakes draw over time, and in knowing which parts of that pattern actually carry information. A single magnitude, 5, 0, is close to meaningless in isolation on a fault this active. This layered against a swarm in December 2024, another swarm in March 2025, and a 6, 4 in March of this year, all clustered in the same general stretch of the western Aleutians. It becomes one more data point in a sequence that seismologists are actively tracking rather than dismissing as routine noise. Whether that sequence continues to fade into background activity, the way the overwhelming majority of earthquake swarms eventually do, or whether it represents the leading edge of stress migrating toward one of the 3 known gaps, is precisely the open question researchers at the Alaska Earthquake Center are watching for in real time, using tools far more precise than any single magnitude number reported in a headline. Here is what those researchers, and by extension what you, would actually want to watch for going forward, describe the same way they would describe it in their own internal reasoning rather than as a dramatic checklist. The first thing is clustering versus migration. If future earthquakes in this region continue to cluster tightly around the same points that have already been active, near Adak and the Andreanof Islands, that is broadly consistent with a normal, if elevated, background sequence working its way through accumulated local strain. If instead new events begin appearing progressively further along the arc, walking toward the Chemagan Gap to the east or further out toward the Commander Islands to the west, that pattern would suggest stress is being transferred from one segment to its neighbor, which is one of the actual physical mechanisms by which a moderate sequence has, in documented cases elsewhere in the world, evolved into something considerably larger. The second thing worth watching is the language used in official bulletins, because agencies like the Alaska Earthquake Center and the United States Geological Survey are notably precise and consistent in how they classify sequences. They will explicitly call a cluster a swarm when there is no identifiable single main shock, exactly as they did in March of last year. They will note when a sequence shows signs of migrating rather than decaying. That precision exists because the language itself carries real informational content for anyone who knows how to read it, and it is publicly available in real time to anyone willing to look rather than wait for a dramatized summary. The third thing, and the one that ties everything back to the 700-year paleoseismic record, is simply patience with the time scale involved. Human news cycles operate in hours and days. This fault system operates on a rhythm that, based on the tsunami deposit record alone, spans centuries. The great earthquakes of 1957, 1964, and 1965, 3 of the largest ever recorded anywhere on Earth, all occurred within an 8-year window of each other, on a fault that had already been building toward that release for decades before any of them happened. There is no reason to expect the current gaps near Yakataga, the Chemagins, or the Commander Islands to resolve on a schedule convenient for anyone's news cycle. They may remain quiet for years. They have already remained quiet for longer than most people currently alive have been paying attention. What should stay with you after this is not a fear of tomorrow. It is a more accurate picture of a fault system that most people have never been taught to think about at all, despite it sitting behind 2 of the largest earthquakes ever measured by modern instruments. The Aleutian Trench is not a dormant hazard waiting for a single dramatic trigger. It is an active, constantly moving plate boundary that has spent the last 125 years working its way down its own length in a sequence of enormous ruptures, and that still has specific, named, monitored sections that have not yet taken their turn. Today's magnitude 5, 0, did not change that underlying picture. It simply reminded the people who track this system, and now you, of exactly where the picture stands. The plates keep converging whether or not anyone is watching. The difference is that some people are watching very closely, and the record they are building, one small earthquake at a time, is the closest thing we have to knowing where. Eventually, this arc goes next,